Now let us study prophetic history that leads up to this great event. The winds of war under the seven trumpets give rise to major religious powers that oppose God's people. Here we find Daniel's prophecy concerning the fall and division of pagan Rome coming to pass under the first, second, third, and fourth trumpets. Brutal attacks by the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Heruli, and Huns fulfilled this prophecy of Daniel chapter 7. Let's move on to question 3. What was cast upon the earth when the first trumpet sounded? Revelation chapter 8, verse 7. What was cast upon the earth when the first trumpet sounded? The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. So it's hail and fire mingled with blood. The most commentators agree that the hail, fire, and blood represent the savage attack upon Rome by the Ostrogoths under their ruthless leader Alaric. They came like a hailstorm with massacre, arson, and cruel oppression. Family members were separated and people were treated with brutality as the hordes swept over Greece, Asia Minor, Italy, Spain, and southern France. The city of Rome was invaded and ravaged for 6 days in the year 410 AD. Now, before we go a little bit further, I want to give some symbols here. And I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting to have a pen and paper handy so we can go through like Revelation chapter 8 so we can tell you what the symbols are, what they mean, and where you can find them. There are other locations in the Bible. And I have here with me my handy-dandy notes. The symbols for four of the trumpets of Revelation chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8 verse 3 talks about the golden censer. It is a portable metal bowl for carrying coals of fire and incense used by priests in sanctuary services. Now here's where your notebook and your pen will come in handy. You can find this in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, chapter 10, verse 1. Leviticus chapter 16, verses 12 and 13. The book of Numbers, chapter 16, verse 46. Also, in Revelation chapter 8, verse 3, it talks about incense. That is prayers of God's people. You can find in the book of Revelation chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. And also in verse 3, it talks about the golden altar. That symbolizes altar of incense, an article of furniture in the holy place of the sanctuary. You can find in the book of Exodus, chapter 30, verses 1 through 9. Now if you go down in Revelation chapter 8, you go down to verse 7, it will talk about hail, fire, and blood. Represents judgment and destruction. You can find in the book of Psalms, chapter 11, verse 6. Psalms chapter 18, verse 8. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, verse 22. The book of Isaiah, chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, and Isaiah chapter 29, verses 1 and verse 6. In Revelation chapter 8, verse 7, it also mentions trees burnt. That symbolizes judgment upon and destruction of God's people. You can find in Jeremiah chapter 11, verses 16 and 17. Jeremiah chapter 21, verse 14. Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 7. Ezekiel chapter 15, verses 6 and 7. The book of Joel chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Book of Zechariah chapter 11, verses 1 and verse 6. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 16 through 20. See, the Bible will interpret itself if we just let the Bible and do its own interpretation. Also in verse 7, it talks about the grass dried and burnt. That represents or symbolizes God's people made desolate. You can find this also in the book of Joel, chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. The book of Psalms, chapter 37, verses 1 and 2. Book of Psalms, chapter 90, verses 5 through 7. Psalms 92, verse 7. Isaiah, chapter 40, verses 6 and 7. Now when you get down to verses 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12, it mentions the third part. The third part, used so frequently in connection with the trumpets, denotes partial measure or incompleteness in connection with the plagues. This term is never used, indicating, no doubt, the much greater extent and severity of these judgments as compared with the trumpets. Many actions of the Bible took place in series of threes, denoting completeness. If you're taking notes, you can find in Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 and 7. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 13. The book of Numbers chapter 22, verse 28. Numbers chapter 24, verse 10. Judges chapter 16, verse 15. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 41. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 25. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 21. The book of Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 and 13. The book of Acts chapter 11, verse 10. When God foretold the doom of nations and the coming of Christ, He declared, I will overturn it, and it will be no more until He comes whose right it is, and I will give it to Him. Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 27. A single overturning would have been incomplete, only a third of the whole. Now as we go down to verse 8, it mentions a mountain. Revelation chapter 8, verse 8 mentions mountain. That mountain symbolizes government or a nation. You can find the backing and support of this in the book of Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 4. The book of Daniel chapter 2, verses 35, 44, and 45. The book of Jeremiah chapter 51, verses 24 and 25. Also in the verse 8, it mentions fire. Fire symbolizes destructive judgment. You can find also in the book of Psalms, chapter 50, verse 3. Psalms 97, verse 3. Jeremiah, chapter 4, verse 4. Isaiah, chapter 10, verses 16 through 18. And 2 Samuel, chapter 22, verses 9 through 16. Now, as you read in chapter 8 of Revelation, the verses 8 through 11, it mentions the sea or waters. Waters or sea in prophecy represent people or inhabited areas. You can find what this means symbolically in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, verse 15. Moving on, in verse 8, it also mentions blood. Blood symbolizes strife or bloodshed. You can find this meaning in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 5, the book of Joel chapter 2, verse 30, Micah chapter 3, verse 10, Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 6, and Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 21 and 22. Now, as we get down to verse 9 of Revelation chapter 8, it mentions creatures and ships in the sea. This symbolizes the sea of humanity and their possessions. You can find this, to back it up in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 47, verses 9 and 10. The book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. Zephaniah, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Once again, I'm giving you all of this information so you can look it up for yourself. And you can do a study on your own so that you can make sure that I'm not misleading you. But you can find all this in the Bible, and you can see for yourself how the Bible will tell you what it's trying to say. You just have to go and look for it. And we're giving you the key to look for it right now. As we get down to verse 10 of chapter 8 of Revelation, it mentions star. That star symbolizes a top leader, or star of the show, or a mighty one. Someone who's in a great form of power. You can find the backing of the Bible in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 10 and 24. The book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 17. In verse 11, it mentions wormwood. Wormwood symbolizes bitterness, sorrow, and death. You can find this in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 29, verse 18. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 9, verses 15 and 16. The book of Amos, chapter 5, verse 7. The book of Acts, chapter 8, verse 23. The book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 15. And finally, as we get down to verse 12 of Revelation chapter 8, it mentions the sun, moon, stars, they are smitten. This symbolizes two things. First thing it symbolizes is light of gospel replaced by darkness. Light of gospel replaced by darkness. You can find also in the book of Psalms, chapter 84, verse 11. the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verse 5. The Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 35. Isaiah, chapter 60, verses 1 through 3. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1. And the second one that it symbolizes is government leaders ousted, or ousted. You can find it in the book of Judges, chapter 5, verse 20. The book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 10 and verse 24. And the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 9 and 10. Now, let's continue into our study. I hope that these symbols and these meanings and where you can find these meanings in the Bible will help you to help better understand the Word of God so that you can better understand the book of Revelation. Because these symbols that we just discussed in chapter 8 will help make chapter 8 make more sense. Okay, let's move along to question number 4 in our study for tonight. The trees of Revelation chapter 8 verse 7 represent God's people. What happened to them? Let's find out. Let's find out what happens to God's people, because the trees symbolize God's people. Revelation chapter 8 verse 7. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. The third part was burnt up. Third part of the trees. The trees symbolize God's people. Trees being burned up represent severe persecution upon and mass destruction of God's people. Did this happen? Yes, it did. When did it happen? History tells us that it happened and took place 1,260 years. From 538 AD, recorded in history, all the way till 1798, which is also known as the Dark Ages, when the Papal Roman Empire persecuted Christians for their belief. Grass also refers to God's people. The burnt grass refers to the desolation and difficult times that came to them. Question number 5. A mountain represents a nation or kingdom. When the nation of the second trumpet was cast into the sea, what happened? Revelation chapter 8, verse 8. Let's find out what happened. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain, burning with fire, was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. Blood refers to the bloodiness of their onslaughts. This fiery mountain represents the Vandals. Under their leader, Genseric, the ships of verse 9 indicate that the power was a maritime power, which indeed it was. Their ships controlled the Mediterranean. At one time, these pirates destroyed 1,110 Roman ships in one night. On land, they pillaged and plundered. The word Vandal comes from their exploits. They ravaged the city of Rome for 14 days in the year 455 AD, taking 1,000 captives, including the empress and her daughters. Once again, all recorded, documented history. Question 6. How many sea creatures and ships were affected when the Vandals struck? And just in case you ever wondered where the word vandalize come from, it came from the Vandals, from over there in the Middle East. That's where we get the word vandalize, because the people known as the Vandals, that's what they would do. They would go around and vandalize places. And we just read a little bit of what they've done, just not even probably a scratch of the stuff that they did do. But that's how we got the term vandalize. When you go to vandalize something, you destroy it and obstruct it. And that's what the Vandals did back in their time in the 400s. So question 6 is, how many sea creatures and ships were affected when the Vandals struck? Revelation chapter 8 verse 9 says, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed. So it was the third part. Creatures in the sea and ships, refer to the sea of humanity and their possessions. Remember how we said that waters and seas represent multitude of people, a vast, great amount of people. And we can find that in Revelation chapter 17, verse 15, where it says that as for the waters which you saw, those are peoples, multitudes, peoples, nations, and tongues. Revelation chapter 17, verse 15 tells us. So the creatures in the sea and ships refer to the sea of humanity and their possessions. The third part means that a sizable portion of people and their possessions were wiped out. And it talks about a third part. If you can remember your history, I can't recall it correctly, but after the Roman Empire split into 10 kingdoms, 3 of the kingdoms were destroyed. It's kind of funny. 3, 3, 3. A third, 3. Question 7. What fell from heaven when the third trumpet sounded? Revelation chapter 8, verse 10. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. A great star burning as it were a lamp. This flaming meteor represents Attila, the leader of the Huns. His troops devastated and occupied Europe from Volga River to the Danube. They killed or forced survivors to pay large indemnities. Attila called himself the scourge of God and boasted that the grass never grew where his horses trod. His warriors scarred their faces to add terror to their appearance. Once his warriors on horseback trampled 200 young ladies to death and left their bodies for the vultures. The word Hun is still a synonym for plunder and pillaging. Question number 8. What was the star called? Revelation chapter 8, verse 11. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Remember, we're talking prophecy, which means when it talks about water, it's talking about a multitude of people. Wormwood means bitterness, and it represents the bitter cruel and heartless onslaughts of the Huns, which resulted in the death of many people.